Good evening and welcome to today's IOP Counterpoint event, Are Liberals Now Illiberal? I'm Vera Chaudhry, an intern at the IOP and a sophomore studying economics and law letters and society when I'm not busy reading The Economist and The Guardian, so I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's panelists. We are so happy to welcome IOP alum and founding member of the Gate, Osita Nwanevu, to tonight's panel. Osita Nwanevu is a contributing editor at the New Republic and columnist at The Guardian, whose work has appeared in multiple outlets, including The New Yorker, Slate, and Harper's Magazine. He's also currently writing a book titled The Right of the People on American Democracy. James Bennet is currently a senior editor for The Economist. Previously, he worked at the New York Times as an editorial page editor from 2016 until he resigned in 2020. And before that, he was the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic for 10 years. Franklin Foer, a staff writer at The Atlantic and former editor of The New Republic, will be moderating our event tonight. I know I'm excited to see what we can learn from this conversation, which is part of the IOP's Counterpoint series focused on bringing civil discourse to opposing viewpoints. Before we get started, a few notes of housekeeping. First, please take a moment right now to silence your cell phones. And when it's time for your tough questions, and this is a panel of journalists, so please ask tough questions, a microphone will be placed in the audience. And please line up behind the microphone where we'll give first priority to students to ask questions. Looking ahead at the IOP, next week the IOP is hosting two events that may be of interest to you. On Tuesday, former Governor Chris Christie will discuss whether truth still matters, and that event will take place here at the International House at 5:30 p.m. On Thursday, April 25th, the IOP will host an event on censorship, which will take place at 5:30 p.m. at Ida Noyes, and food will be provided. With that, let's give a warm welcome to our speakers tonight, Osita Nwanevu, James Bennet, and Franklin Foer.
I was wondering. Interesting choice.
No, speakers should be allowed to request.
I would have had a totally different choice.
Baseball game, the right walk-on music. So tonight, our mission is to have a spirit in a debate in the spirit of liberalism about whether liberals are becoming illiberal. And of course, the question is framed in a way that is a polite version of what is more polemically framed, or, is wokeism emblematic of a rising illiberalism? Is there a new spirit of McCarthyism that's taking hold in various institutions? That's the kind of the more extreme way the question's been phrased. And James, when people talk about the new illiberalism, your resignation from the New York Times and the whole controversy over the Tom Cotton op-ed is usually held up as Exhibit A. And so I thought, you also wrote an article in The Economist recounting what had happened and why it was emblematic of a rising spirit of intolerance. And so I thought the place to start is with you and kind of making the case that you make. When you said that there was a growing spirit of intolerance and the Times was emblematic of that, what did you mean?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all very much for coming, and thank the IOP for having us here. I got to be a fellow at the IOP actually after I was chased out of the New York Times, and they gave
a refugee.
Yes, but I never got to come here because it was still COVID and we did everything by Zoom. So it's really nice to be here. Where to begin with this? I mean, we can discuss that particular incident again, which does still come up all the time. I did write a very long piece about it myself. I think one reason it does come up, and one reason I finally sat down and wrote about it, is I think it was kind of one of the biggest collisions we've seen between the old conventional values of journalism and the ascendant values. I actually don't use the word woke myself because I think it kind of shuts the conversation down. I don't use the word cancel myself because I don't think it gets us anywhere. And I have actually a milder, I think, critique than would be supported by a term like McCarthyism for what's happening. But I do have concerns about kind of the direction of journalism. This conversation is framed very broadly in terms of are liberals becoming illiberal. I do think journalism, it's not just professional narcissism to think that journalism is an important frame to approach that question, because journalism has, for all its great imperfections over the course of the 20th century, did, I think, play and aspire to play an important role in creating a kind of shared understanding of reality in the country, and creating a means by which groups with very different views of reality could still be in some form of conversation with each other. And my concern about some of the new thinking is we're losing that. And the reporter's creed, in my view, was very much grounded in some basic liberal principles, including curiosity, empathy, humility, and skepticism, intense skepticism about everything. Those were the ideals. They often were not put into practice, and I think repeated failures by news organizations and even some universities to live by or honor those values is what made them so brittle and so fragile. I'm concerned now. There's sort of three categories of journalism I think are decaying because of the change. One is the pursuit of an impartial, to the extent humans are capable of representing it, representation of reality. The second is platforms where there are wide ranges of views that are presented, where everybody has to play by the same rules. And the third is a kind of opinion journalism that holds its own side to account and critiques its own side. And the reasons for the change aren't about bad faith or malice or anything. As usual, it's about our political polarization and changes in technology and their implications for the business model of journalism. I don't know if we might want to get into some of this stuff later. But I experienced this at the New York Times, and you don't have to go back to my particular incident.
Can you just, just so that everybody in the room is read in, I know this is painful, and I know it's, and give the 3-sentence summary of what happened at the New York Times.
I am incapable of a 3-sentence summary.
Okay, do you want me to give it the 3-sentence?
We published, I'll do it. We published in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we were conducting what we aspired to do, which was, I thought, a pretty wide-ranging debate about everything from police reform to and the future of policing and the prisons, to the nature of that incident itself. There was, in addition to peaceful protests taking place around the country, there was some looting and rioting in cities. We published a piece by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a Republican, and a veteran, arguing that the military should be called out in areas where the police were overwhelmed to quell riots. And there was a very, very strong reaction against that piece within the New York Times. And a number of my colleagues felt and argued that it put journalists in danger, and I can be very defensive and give you my own take on that. But within 2 days or 2.5 days, I was asked to resign.
Sorry, that was very efficient, and so
let me just give you the editor-in-chief of the Times. I think it's worth noting. He said in 2020 that the New York Times still didn't understand how Donald Trump got elected in 2016, and that's an incredible admission, I think, and tells you that the paper couldn't claim to be really representing the country truthfully to its readers. And just last week, the new editor-in-chief of the Times said to the Wall Street Journal that, let me just get this quote right, that he said, and this is stronger than I would put it, he said, younger adults who are coming up through the education system are less accustomed to this sort of open debate, this sort of robust exchange of views. And as a result, he went on to say that they're having trouble with the Israel-Gaza Israel-Palestine coverage because there are really, really strong passions about that issue and not much willingness to really explore the perspectives of people who are on the other side. And I think that's a hopeful statement because the beginning of any 12-step program is admitting you have a problem. But I think, sorry, I'm banging on too long. I think my worry about this is that I don't think I'm clinging on to these principles for the sake of clinging on to them. I think they played an incredibly important role in helping people get at the truth, equipping readers to reach their own opinions about the truth, and even to some degree holding the country together. And I'm not sure what the alternative is.
Yeah. So just to recap, so your argument is that what you see in journalism is emblematic of a collapse of a certain set of liberal values about how conversations should be conducted, about how the public sphere should function, and that what you're seeing there is emblematic of what exactly?
Well, it's a return to a 19th century kind of model of media in which anybody with a printing press can find a big enough audience to support them, and every reader can kind of choose their own reality, and we get the opportunity to cocoon ourselves. I think it reinforces the polarization, the fragmentation that we're experiencing. And my big worry is, I don't know how the great diversity of the country is a source of strength and progress rather than a source of conflict in a media environment like the one I just described.
Osita, so I know that you've been critical of that type of view of, or at least the fetishization of that type of public sphere, that type of, the importance of that type of discourse to liberalism. Is that fair?
Well, I should say, first of all, it's good to be back in Chicago. I am one of these woke young people who's come up through these educational institutions over the last 10, 15 years or so. I like debate. I like arguing with people. It's what I do for a living. So, I'm happy to hear representing, maybe I'm the one young person in all of America who's still capable of hashing things out with people. The annoying Chicago thing I'm going to do right now is insist that we define our terms in the first place. So the question, are liberals now illiberal, uses the word liberal in two different senses I think they're worth unpacking. In the first place, you're talking about a faction of people within the context of American politics, liberals. Liberals, I would describe as people who believe that the major problems that we're facing in American society, whether it's economic inequality, climate change, racial justice issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, these are problems that can be addressed through a set of reforms that are possible through pre-existing institutions without making too deep structural changes within the economy. We have the tools that we need right now within existing politics to address those major issues. I'm a leftist. I'm somebody who believes that we need to make deep structural changes to the economy in order to actually get at the progress we want on all of those different fronts. So, in that sense, I'm talking when I'm here before you all today about a different faction of American politics, and I exist in some tension with it. However, I'm a leftist who considers himself very strongly a liberal in that second sense. In that second sense, we're talking about a philosophical tradition that's about like 400, 500 years old, the last few centuries. A philosophical tradition that's been built around the idea that there is something called the individual. Each and every one of us is possessed of a certain fundamental dignity, no matter who we are, no matter what station we begin our lives within, that entitles us to a basic level of respect and a basic framework of rights and privileges. This is the foundation, as many people say, of the Western world as we know it today. And I consider myself somebody who is still deeply committed, and has always been deeply committed to those principles. In fact, I think that one of the reasons why I am a leftist is because I think that instantiating, making freedom real, liberal individuality real for people, means empowering them through granting them rights and an amount of say that they don't presently have in the economy. That's the only basis upon which people have the freedom and the capacity to choose the destinies that they rationally decide are work for them. That's the only way we actually instantiate liberalism. So ultimately, I think that the changes that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years in American life, when it comes to what people call wokeness, when it comes to what people call social progressivism, those changes to me, and maybe James can come up with counterexamples, are still changes that are being made in the interest of securing those basic individual rights and that basic level of respect that we're all entitled to. Two groups have been previously denied them by the force of American history, by public policy, whatever you want to call it. I don't see in most of social progressivism a broad turn away from the idea that people have individual rights. You hear people like Andrew Sullivan say this, you hear people like Barry Weiss say this. I don't think that that's basically backed up by the evidence. In most of what you hear people who are being called woke say, there are exceptions to this, obviously, but there are factions that are unrepresentative within every ideology. I do not think that Ibram Kendi speaks for every single person who considers himself interested in the issues of racial justice, interested in the issues of trans rights, and so on and so forth. So I'm not seeing in wokeness a kind of broad turn away from individual rights, because it would be a very hard thing to do. That's the water that we are all swimming in. I think even leftists who say or claim they are Marxists who reject the basic framework of individual rights and freedoms are still people who, when you ask them what their perfect world looks like, well, I'd like the freedom to do X or Y, I just can't do it now because the economy is so oppressive and isn't structured in a way that allows me to live the way that I would want to and the people I care about would want to. That is the liberal ideal in a sense. I mean, it was a novel and contestable idea just a couple hundred years ago, that the course you would take in life was not going to be determined by your family and your clan. It was not going to be determined by religion that you belong to. All of these sort of external circumstances. The idea that it was up to each and every one of us to decide what our own destiny was going to be. That is sort of the core idea. I think most people in American life adhere to that idea. And so if we're having a debate about whether or not that idea is dying, I think that there are threats to it that we can talk about. They're not coming from progressives. But I don't see social progressivism as striking against that. Now, when it comes to the specific debates that James is referring to, that people have been reading about for the last 10 years about on college campuses, I think that those tensions and debates can be understood as existing and happening within the house of liberalism. I think that there are editorial disputes that are happening right now that are a function of the changes that we're experiencing right now in American politics. I think that you can say the same thing about much of the campus unrest and uneasiness over the last 10 years. But I don't think, for example, where you came down on whether the New York Times should have published a Tom Cotton op-ed determines whether you were a liberal or an illiberal. It was not a debate between, on the one hand, the forces of light and good and truth and nobility and liberalism and free discourse on one hand, and the forces of darkness who hate liberalism and who think that free speech is white supremacist and so on. On the other hand, it was an editorial dispute about a particular op-ed that was happening within the context of an institution that the reality is, you can frame it as an institution that has as its mission the representation of a broad range of views, but in practice, as James, I think, admits in that Economist piece, it's actually restricted and been highly restrictive of the kinds of opinions that it has within its pages. The Tom Cotton op-ed was not the first time the New York Times has said we do not want to have this kind of hard right view on our pages. I think the New York Times, on a regular basis, as its kind of basic operating procedure, excludes most right-wing opinion. That was true under James's tenure. You had people like Ross Douthat, you had people like David Brooks, you had Bret Stephens, who was brought on. These three people are not representative of the Republican Party right now. Right now, we've added David French to that mix. There are 2 Never Trump columnists named David at the New York Times, and 0 who represent mainstream Republican opinion.
Yeah.
So this idea that the New York Times was sort of going about its business, representing all kinds of views, and all of a sudden these kind of woke digital staffers came in and ruined this kind of free and open discursive environment, I think is not true to the way that the New York Times as a paper has generally functioned. It does worse than the Washington Post on this front. The Washington Post has Mark Thiessen, it has Hugh Hewitt, alongside mainstream conservatives, right? I don't think you can lay the blame for a kind of narrowness, if you care about narrowness, at the feet of
just in terms of just
young,
in defining terms and defining kind of how you conceptualize liberalism, I think what James is arguing about the liberal spirit is not just the pursuit of a certain type of freedom. It was also involved an idea about how society functions, how debates, how differences of opinion get mediated through productive disagreement and through debate and through the construction of something that organically accreted called the public square.
Here's what I would say about that, and I sort of was going to say at the beginning, but sort of got off track. When we look at the liberal freedoms, I think there are two that are of direct relevance to all of these debates. One of them needs no introduction, that is freedom of speech. The idea that in society we should all have the right to speak freely, to think freely, to argue, without the interference of some kind of broad arbitrary authority that shuts down debate. Everybody loves freedom of speech. I think freedom of speech is good. I think it is under-recognized by Americans, generally speaking, that there are different speech regimes in the world. I am a fan of the First Amendment. I'm a fan of the speech regime we've built here in the United States. I think it is the best one for a lot of different reasons. Other liberal societies have made different decisions. In Europe, it is extremely common, in fact universal, both at the EU level and at the national level, to have state restrictions on hate speech, state restrictions on the ability to deny the Holocaust that we do not have in this country. When I hear people, and as I've heard multiple times over the last 10 years, say, well, if you were somebody who's like a college sophomore in the United States and you read an op-ed for your campus paper that we should have hate speech laws, well, you are an Orwellian Stalinist who will destroy all light and truth in American society because free speech cannot function with hate speech laws. I don't agree with hate speech laws, but I don't think that is an accurate rendering of the way free speech functions in places, basically every other country but the United States, which is highly unusual in that respect. But in general, free speech, important, good, okay. The other freedom that I think is important that gets shoved to the side is freedom of association. This idea that in society, to do things, basically the constitutive parts of society, groups, we should have the right to join up with people who share our values, we think will be assets to a particular project. Again, this is sort of the basis of society, when you're talking about companies, civic groups, political parties, unions, ultimate frisbee leagues, whatever. This is the thing that makes society what it is, not just a kind of web or bucket of individuals, right? That freedom is, I think, in some ways as important as freedom of speech. Is the means by which change happens. It's the means by which we actually do politics, not just by arguing, but by joining together with people to do things that we think are important. That is the way that journalism happens. People form magazines and newspapers and so on. So what I would say is this. These two freedoms and these two rights constrain the state's capacity to impose itself on the public sphere. The state with a monopoly on violence that governs us all cannot come in and say, this is the kind of newspaper you should run, this is the kind of university you should run, this is the kind of opinion that you should be allowed to publish, not allowed to publish. Some entity on high cannot come down and make that decision for us. But when we come together and start universities or start newspapers or start magazines, we have the right, I think, under liberalism to say, these are the kinds of ideas that I think are worth publishing and I think are valuable. These are the kinds of ideas that I don't think are as interesting. The New York Times does this, but it does this in a different way than the New Republic does.
Right. So, but are you saying that in the case of the New York Times, that when the staff said we don't want to publish this Tom Cotton op-ed, they were just acting out their freedom of association?
They were articulating a different view of what the values of the paper should be, in a way that I do not think
a superior view, or
well, I'm not working at the New York Times. I will never work at the New York Times, partially because I have a different understanding of what I want to do with my journalism. That's why I write for left-wing publications. Look, if you are somebody who goes to the New York Times and you believe in its declared mission, whether or not it adheres to that mission is a different question, but if you believe in the declared mission of we're going to represent the range of opinion that exists out there in America and present it to people, I think, as I said a couple of days after the Tom Cotton op-ed, you have more pieces like the Tom Cotton op-ed and not less. And I think that the fact that people were so shocked and surprised by the Tom Cotton op-ed was reflective of the fact that you do not get hard right opinion in the New York Times very often, and that is not the fault of digital staffers who got there 2 or 3 years ago. And to frame the debate in that way and to say that the people who opposed that op-ed were illiberal because they drew a different line of boundary than the New York Times had driven previously. You're not having a debate about whether or not there should be a line. They were arguing that it should be in a different place, and that op-ed didn't meet.
I think you've got a lot to respond to here.
Yeah, if I could just respond to Osita's point about debate at the Times being historically constrained, I couldn't agree with that more. And in fact, I'd take it a step further. You said that the Times didn't publish that many right-wing voices. We actually didn't publish many left-wing voices either.
I know.
And when I got to the Times in 2016, there were 11 opinion columnists at the New York Times. 2 of them are speaking here in the next few days, actually, I saw on the screen outside. This is 2016, 11 columnists, each of them individually awesome, right? But as a group, consider the composite. Out of that group, out of 11, only 2 were women. Out of that group, only 1 was a person of color, and only ever had been. The Times didn't appoint a black columnist to the opinion section until the 90s, I think 1993, and thereafter it only had 1 at a time. Only 2 of them identified as conservative. Some people can argue about how conservative they actually were. They, I guess, don't fit your definition of hard right. And not a single one at that time represented what was really the ascendant wing ideologically of the Democratic Party, which was the new progressivism that was represented by Bernie Sanders. So we were trying to change all of that, and we did, a lot of it. We moved, actually, we had much more success hiring people to the left and having them be celebrated within the Times than we did hiring people who were to the right. But Osita's totally right that, the first conservative columnist I hired was Bret Stephens, who I consider to be one of the most eloquent anti-Trump voices in the country, and is probably the most pro-immigration writer on that page. And he's a graduate of the University of Chicago and a deep believer in the classical liberal idea, and engages, I think, with a very open mind with critics. And one of the reasons I was so proud to hire him. His hiring was not celebrated within the New York Times. And so I totally agree, and that's what I was referring to at the outset when I was saying that a lot of these organizations had not honored these liberal values, and that's what made them brittle. Totally agree with that. I just think there's a place, I think there's a need for the kind of thing we were trying to do. And that was not, hard right is I would quarrel with that characterization, but I understand what you're saying. There were other hard right, in accepting that term, so many others, that was the one that precipitated the biggest and final explosion for me, but by no means alone. But it's you're right about Hugh Hewitt. The Post publishes essentially pro-Trump columnists, and it was impossible to do that at the New York Times. I think that's a big problem. I may be wrong about that, but I think it ought to be possible. And
defend in the way.
Can I just quickly clarify my terms? I actually struggled with this. It's an interesting problem. I didn't think, for my own purposes, a pro-Trump columnist was not somebody I could find in that era, because it was just about the cult of personality rather than any coherent body of policy. So it was very hard to find somebody, and this may be my own bias showing here, but that I felt was an intellectually honest kind of voice that would fit with our page, which is why I never hired somebody. What we tried to do instead was solicit columns from people who were arguing specific policy positions that were consistent with the positions that Donald Trump was taking one day and sometimes changing, and pieces that would meet our various standards for accuracy and so forth.
But defend your vision against what Osita is describing, because it's 2 different ways of thinking about how institutions should function. Osita is saying it's, let's have plurality, let's have diversity of opinion, but it should take place in a way in which people, it sounds like, associate based on their political allegiance, and they can have disagreements within that place. But you were defending.
I just say too, not even just political allegiance. I think that idea that James has about what the New York Times should be is a perspective. The University of Chicago's idea of what a university should be is a perspective. It's not like a partisan perspective, but it's a contestable idea. And people should be able to affiliate on the basis of those ideas. If you want to have a publication that does what the New York Times does, I think that is obviously your right, and you can. I do not think it is illiberal, and this is the thing I was trying to say, illiberal for people to say, I want to run a different kind of publication, I want to run a different kind of university.
Yeah.
And so what's at stake here is not, for me, liberal values.
But so let James defend the vision of the New York Times as a model of a certain type of public square that embodies a certain type of liberal.
Again, I've been so lucky in my career. I've worked in newspapers, I've worked in magazines, I've been a reporter, I've written very opinionated magazine pieces. I write an opinion column now. I'm a huge believer in a very rich and diverse media ecology that where people do associate around with the kind of journalism that they value and want to participate in. And I wasn't doing this. I also, wasn't doing this by myself. I was hired by the Sulzbergers very specifically with the goal of widening the range of Times opinion because of the sense, and again, I have no right to speak for the New York Times. I mean, they've made that clear. But at that time, the ambition was the sense of civic responsibility that the family had was that the Times should be, at least it was described to me, that they wanted to reach a much wider range of Americans than they were reaching. Their subscriptions have grown substantially since then, but the range of Americans that they're reaching and that have confidence in that they're getting the truth from the New York Times, I don't think has grown. And they were trying to address that problem, I think. So that was the vision, and not every journalistic organization remotely by my light should subscribe to the same set of ideas.
But I guess the point I'm making is this. When we have these conversations, disputes, whether it's on campus or at a publication, and the nature of the dispute is not just, well, you and I are having a disagreement about whether this was right to publish, we're having an editorial disagreement, or you and I are having a disagreement about whether or not this speaker should be on campus, and we can have a substantive disagreement about the views in question. But when the register is, because you disagree with me on this question, you are now at war with some of the principles that underpin Western civilization, liberal values. That is the thing that I think I've taken the most exception to, this kind of reaching for this grand, superior principle that I think is a means, rhetorically, for a lot of people who do this, of shutting down debate, of saying, look, we can't just argue about this specific thing, this specific op-ed. The fact that you're disagreeing with me means that you are undermining something fundamental about liberal society. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think that's true of journalists at the Times who didn't. I think that there are people who disagree with James for all kinds of reasons. There wasn't necessarily one constituency. Certainly, maybe it was predominantly young, but it was not all young people. It was not all people of color. There were people who at the Times, been Times for a long time who thought differently. But my point is, there's something about the register in which even the question framing this debate is placed within that troubles me. Because I think it is a means of saying that people who disagree with you, especially if they're progressive, are at war with certain fundamental principles that I don't think they're actually at war with. And it's a way of sort of making them seem foreign or making them seem alien to values that I think we actually do all share.
Do you want to respond to that? Because I think that.
Well, again, we could endlessly litigate this one particular decision, and maybe that's how I'm going to spend the rest of my life. I disagree that principles aren't at stake, and I think the work is too hard, and you take too much heat as an editor publishing work that is provocative, that unsettles the status quo, that challenges people's particularly within your own tribe, their orthodoxy, you take too much heat not to have principles be at stake to make it worthwhile. And articulating those principles, reminding your readers of them, your colleagues of them, is the only way to get that kind of work done. I think there are principles at stake. And I think in that particular case, and having, the whole point was to have debate, and I'm totally fine with people telling me I made a bad decision, it was a bad choice, shouldn't run that piece, it's wrong for all these reasons. We didn't really have that debate about the piece. And in fact, you know, the argument that got made specifically about that piece was that it had put people in danger. There wasn't the kind of an engagement with the substance of it. And that had the effect of short-circuiting any really meaningful debate about it. I'm very worried about that argument. And it's totally understandable, by the way. Emotions were running high. It was an incredibly intense time in the country. I certainly don't understand what happened in the summer of 2020, and I'm looking forward, I hope, to some good books that explain it all to me. So I think it's totally understandable people were upset. The argument that it made people unsafe, though, Osita, I think that was not like a substantive. Nobody ever really explained to me how it made them unsafe. And in the end, we actually did publish the story, right. and nobody was hurt by it. And in fact, to the extent, you know, we could measure the response, support for the position Cotton was arguing dropped after he published the piece. So to my view, that's the way it's supposed to work. Like, sure. There's a debate, people say this is a terrible idea doesn't get concretized in policy. That's a good outcome. Makes people safer if you believe his idea made them unsafe in the first place.
Well,
so,
I mean, I don't want this to just be about Tom Cotton, because I think there are a lot of different things to talk about. As I said, I didn't have the same level of trepidation or anxiety about the Cotton piece being published. I didn't think it was going to make that much material difference in the world. But I do understand people who said that the idea of raising or invoking the Insurrection Act was an action that could put journalists in danger, broadly speaking, and that it was an argument that was being made. I actually believe this myself. I think it was an argument that was being made to dramatize or sort of deepen people's anxiety about the protests, to sort of gin up fear about them, to stoke fantasies of vengeance at these these people, these progressives who are going out and causing disorder. I think that was the function of the op-ed. And I don't think people at the Times were wrong to be troubled by that, because I think that there were things to be troubled by. Tom Cotton, just a couple of days ago, I guess maybe you knew this event was happening, we were going to talk about this, said something that was very interesting. He was talking about the protests, the Gazan protesters who were on the Golden Gate Bridge a couple of days ago. And he said, look, if these people had been in Arkansas, they would have been thrown off a bridge. If they'd had their hands glued to the pavement or something, well, people in Arkansas wouldn't have minded. They would have had their skin ripped off by people who take matters into their own hands. That's the phrase that he used. This is the person who Tom Cotton is. You know, again, I don't want to get too much in the weeds of this, but so Adam Rubenstein wrote a piece about this controversy and what happened behind the scenes for The Atlantic, and where it detailed the editorial process. What actually happened, and James can correct me on any of these points, is that Tom Cotton came to the New York Times with an idea of doing a piece about Twitter content moderation. He tweeted his idea about the Insurrection Act, kind of offhandedly. Twitter told him to take it down. He comes to the New York Times and says, Twitter's content moderation policy is kind of unfair. I'd like to write something about it. Or, as is usually the case for politicians, I'd like to have my staffers write something in my name about this. Editors at the Times say, that's boring. I'm actually really interested in this Insurrection Act idea that you talked about. It would be great if you laid this out in a full piece. If you laid out an argument in the New York Times for Donald Trump invoking the Insurrection Act, calling up the military to deal with these unruly protests. And Tom Cotton says, yes. Rubenstein says in The Atlantic that in the initial drafts that he had gotten from Cotton, he had not made a sufficient enough distinction between rioters and looters and ordinary peaceful protesters. And he had to insert that into the piece, which is editorially fascinating to me, actually. It's an episode, and again, I think a lot of these things are not interesting to people who are not journalists. But there's some kind of line, I think, between presenting the world as it is to people and saying, here's an opinion that exists out in the world, we're going to give it to you, we're going to tell you what Tom Cotton thinks about X, Y, or Z just by representing it. And creating a situation, right? In saying that, well, you didn't necessarily have this idea, but we'd like you to write about it. Your piece wasn't sufficiently safe enough for the New York Times in this respect, so we're going to insert that line there to make sure you're making the distinction that you did not yourself make clear. I, as an editor, am going to do that for you and present that to people as your actual position. That, I think, was editorially interesting to me. I think that there are a lot of complicated questions that go into how that happened. I just think that this was not some kind of simple, again, debate between are people who hate speech, are people who like speech. The people who like speech wanted Tom Cotton op-ed published. People who hated speech didn't want it published. There were a lot of complicated issues at work here. I think there are things that people legitimately had concerns about. And I think that where you fell along those lines is not you're liberal if you agreed with it, and you're illiberal if you disagreed with it. I just don't think that's a productive way of framing what happened. Was I wrong on any of the points about?
Well, I think you're drawing a lot of inferences there that I think are unfair to Tom Cotton and to the editors at the New York Times. You're describing the way editors work. They weren't, the op-ed editor at the time who reported to me, you're right, saw the tweet. We published a lot of pieces already on this question of censorship. He was more interested in this other idea that was in the mainstream of American discussion at the time, and we hadn't published a piece that represented that point of view. It wasn't an idea he put in Tom Cotton's head. It was an idea Tom Cotton had already put out in the world, but had not stood up in any kind of rigorous way. And to say we forced that distinction on him, I think, is unfair. When you write, I don't know, your pieces may come out without requiring the intervention of an editor, but often people think they've been clear about something without having been clear about something. And Tom Cotton was not calling, and it wasn't in his mind that the piece would be understood to be calling for military to suppress peaceful protest.
But how do we know that? If it wasn't in the original draft
I can
of the
only
piece.
look at his own record, and actually I've talked to him about it since then. I certainly don't know. There's no evidence for a bad faith construction.
One other thing that I would say about
James.
There's no evidence for. I think writers often need to be told that you risk confusing the reader here, and you need to be clear about what you're actually saying, and we were clear about it. Unfortunately, the New York Times then reported that he called for troops to be used to suppress protest, which was part of what created a lot of the confusion. I don't think that the news side covered itself in glory with the way it covered that particular controversy. I think that's what simplified it. I think it was a very complicated situation. I think it would have been great if we'd had a big debate about it and dealt with it in all its complexity, and I would have been happy to have this conversation and be proved wrong, but we didn't. But I don't think that was, I'll cop to a lot of things, but I don't think that was my fault.
So one thing I will say about the initial tweets that Tom Cotton wrote that inspired this piece, that led to this piece. In those tweets, he says not only does he think that the Insurrection Act should be invoked against rioters and looters, and he calls insurrectionists, I think. He uses the word anarchist. The Insurrection Act should be invoked against anarchists. Now, I don't know if you guys know, but it's not actually illegal to be an anarchist in the United States, right? That, to me, is an indication of unseriousness. This is somebody who is not making appropriate and fine distinctions between the kinds of protests we should allow and the kinds of protests we shouldn't. This is somebody who, again, is acting as a demagogue to say there's this entire category of people that are causing public disorder, and I'm going to be particularly careful in saying who it is, but the military should do something. The fact that that then is reflected in the initial draft of the piece as an insufficient distinction that an editor has to change, I think is important. The difference between me and Tom Cotton is that I'm not a United States senator, right? And I don't have people publishing my opinions on the basis of, well, this is an important person, we should care what he thinks, we should inform the public about what he has to say. If that is the case, and that is the case for publishing Tom Cotton, I think you have a responsibility to accurately render to people what this public official actually thinks and believes. I do not think, in the context of Tom Cotton's career, we have enough evidence to say that this is a man who thinks clearly and seriously about free speech rights, about what could have happened if the military had been invoked, about who is actually causing the disorder.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's evidence in what you said just a couple of days ago, that this is somebody who we had some kind of obligation to publish an opinion of, because he's actually somebody who's thinking seriously about these questions. I think there's evidence that he didn't.
I don't know how much more you want to.
I mean, I think there's a lot you can say about op-ed model being broken and op-eds being fundamentally stupid. I will tell you that we published Vladimir Putin. The New York Times published Adolf Hitler back in the middle of the last century. This is not an argument for. I published the piece that troubles me most, and I refer to this in the piece I wrote. I published a piece by a leader of the Taliban.
Taliban, that's right. Yeah.
I published, and I'm proud of it, I published a piece by Marwan Barghouti from prison in Israel. I published a piece from an Israeli settler. This was a much wider range of opinion than the Times had published before. I defend those decisions. But I do think and again, anyway, I've said my piece.
I'd like to just take this back up to the highest level, and I feel like what we need to do is to kind of shift to the larger question of the way in which the public sphere, is supposed to.
But seriously though, if the Times publishes Vladimir Putin, does that, what is beyond the pale? I guess is my question. Tom Cotton is beyond the pale, but Putin is not, or how do you think about?
Well, I happily work for a left-wing publication where we don't think that we have an obligation to represent views just because they exist in the world. That's what the Times does, and the Times has to answer that question for itself.
I actually think that I'd like you to just answer that question about, and this is, I think, you've said you don't understand why all this elevates to kind of this level of national controversy, and why it feels like the stakes are so large when the backlash happens, when there's all this pressure for James to get fired, and the idea that an opinion causes people to feel unsafe. It feels like there is some sort of institution, not just institutional value. The New York Times represents something, the op-ed page represents something, and a lot of things that it represent is the idea that there is this space within American democracy where maybe never quite fulfilled in an adequate sort of way, where disagreement happens. And this episode encapsulated a lot of other fears that people had about the diminution of those types of spaces. And Osita is saying, I think, that there's freedom of association. If the University of Chicago wants to take on a certain different ideological cast, that's fine. If the New York Times takes on a different ideological cast, that's fine.
The way to reduce it is this. There are people at the New York Times who thought it was right to publish Adolf Hitler. That's a particular vision of what the New York Times is for.
It's actually a bad example. I shouldn't have used it. It was a magazine piece, and it was...
My point is this. What I was going to say is, whether it's Adolf Hitler or Vladimir Putin or the Taliban or Tom Cotton, I don't think people at the New York Times who say, this doesn't really, there are all kinds of things we don't publish. I don't necessarily think that that's what we do. I don't think that makes them illiberal. I don't think that makes them, you called them fragile in your Economist piece. You used the word fragile. You talked about them mounting these concerns because they wanted to be part of the cool crowd, I don't think that's like a generous and like realistic understanding of like the different values that will naturally come into conflict, or different perspectives will naturally come into conflict when you publish controversial things. I don't think that's a generous read of the people who disagree with the Tom Cotton op-ed. That's all I'm saying. I don't think it's liberalism that's at stake. I think those people are good liberals. They just disagreed with you about an editorial decision.
I think it goes deeper than that. I don't think it's just that one editorial decision, because as I said, it happened over and over again, and only when we published views from the right. As I said, the Tom Cotton piece was the most extreme manifestation of this. But I really don't disagree at all with the argument that if this is what a publication wants to be, it has the absolute right to be that. And if journalists only want to work for a publication that represents, a particular range of views and that's totally a reasonable thing. I do think there's a law. I think there's a civic value, and why I worked so hard to try to create a space where this kind of conversation was possible. I think there's civic value to a platform in which, and I know you're not, Osita, satisfied with the quality of the Cotton op-ed. I can point you to many that we published, unfortunately, that were worse, but where people have to meet certain standards for accuracy and not using to the extent, ad hominem, where they're edited by the same people and held to the same standard. I think there's value I believe in that, and I'm very worried that it doesn't.
Just go deeper and describe what would be lost if that space disappeared.
I just don't. I think we are. I fear I just sound so banal and pompous when I start talking about this, but it's so easy. I like to do it myself to just, retreat into a sort of a cocoon of like-minded people and like-minded views, and as I said at the outset, think that's one reason why Americans just are losing, why our politics has become so divided and ossified.
Osita,
I think it's an impediment, Osita, even to some of the, and I agree with your description of the desire, what's happened in this century and the push for structural change. I think it's actually an impediment to making those kind of changes.
So to pull it out of journalism inside baseball stuff, back to the original question, I think the fundamental point, or one of the fundamental points I want to make here, is that liberalism means something very specific. Maybe it's just because I've been reading political philosophy for the last 3 years in the course of writing this book about democracy, but when people use the word liberal as a philosophical tradition, it means something very specific and important to sustaining the kind of society that we have here today. And so when people throw around the word illiberal to describe the other side of a disagreement that they have about a particular issue, I think that's something that we have to be wary of. I think it's something we have to be wary of, especially at a time when I think, as I said at the very beginning, we do see elements of what I would call genuine illiberalism taking hold in American life. When you have governors and people with the power of these states saying people shouldn't read certain books, that certain things shouldn't be taught at colleges, certain teachers should be investigated for the things that they say. When you have somebody who might be president next year saying that one of the first things he wants to do is purge these civil institutions of people who he thinks are politically suspect. He wants to deport leftists and so on. That to me is kind of cut and dry illiberalism. And it's a very serious thing. It's not something to be sort of trivially deployed as a rhetorical cudgel against people you don't like, you disagree with, for reasons that are not that fundamental. Liberalism is not a vibe. It's not a temperament. It's not a discursive mode. We're here at the University of Chicago. We can talk about Socrates, right? So this more model discussant and conversant went around asking people fundamental questions, impertinent questions, heterodox questions. Those habits, I think, are important. Those are habits that I try to live by. That is not liberalism, right? That is a way of asking questions. That's a kind of discursive mode. Liberalism is a fundamental set of principles about the way society ought to be structured and the rights and freedoms that we have as individuals. And when you say that progressives, or whoever it happens to be, is fundamentally at war with those principles, I think you have to be very careful, because that is something that puts them outside the bounds of things that we accept to be important and true in society. It's a way of sidelining them and sidelining their concerns.
Do you want to respond to that? Because I think that let's move it to questions and answers after you respond. But
well, first of all, I agree that illiberalism is a bigger problem on the right than on the left. But I disagree that it's not a problem or doesn't exist on the left. And I guess I'm not sure what a discursive mode, I don't know how to respond to discursive mode. I think there's an ethos of liberalism too that embraces not just the idea of speech, but the idea of listening. And that's what I fear is kind of being lost. I don't think we have a problem on the speech front. I think we have a problem on the listening front.
let's move it to
Let's listen.
Q&As.
And the mic's over there, I think.
Yeah, oh, the mic's over there, sorry.
Hi there, folks. Thank you for the talk. My name is Davis. I'm an alum of the University of Chicago. At the start of the talk, Mr. Foer, you mentioned things such as, the principles of the spirit of McCarthyism, spirit of intolerance, and I wanted to sort of ask about what kinds of economic material conditions might underpin spirits in journalism. Just for context, newsroom employment has fallen by more than 2/3 since 2008, from around 71,000 to around 20,000, maybe a little more than that. Ad revenues since '08 have fallen from around 70 billion in print media to 5 billion, where Google has gone from around 20 billion to well over 200 billion. Journalism is clearly materially endangered. If journalism is the public square of America, then it's a public square that's been a private enterprise and more substantially defunded than any other element of American society or civil society, as far as I know of. So it would be extremely strange if the principles of a group of people did not fall under substantial influence when 2/3 of those people are removed from that group in less than a generation. If journalism is under attack, I'd like to hear to what extent does the attack on the principles of journalism relate to the attack on the actual profession of journalism in hard material terms, how that influences the principles, and just what is necessary in the material underpinning of journalism, the journalism industry, to generate liberalism as a principle. Thanks.
You want to take a
Well, I referred glancingly to this at the beginning, and it's something, the numbers you cite are accurate and, to my mind, devastating. The number of newspapers that have gone out of business in the last 20 years, the number of journalists, I think it's 45,000 that have been thrown out of work. New digital publications are not filling the void. They're going out of business as fast as they're being created. Last year we were losing 2.5 newspapers a year, and the ones that remain, many of them are shells of what they were. They're still there, but they employ many fewer people. They're less able to report on their communities, and I think the wipeout of local journalism, which is really what we're talking about, has had devastating consequences for the country. Devastating consequences for communities that have nobody who's holding their local governments accountable. I think it's a big reason for the decline of trust, because people have been deprived of a journalism that they can verify with their own eyes. And I think it's deprived national media organizations of reporters who also had the experience of having to report on a community where they were held accountable for the accuracy of their work and the empathy with which they treated their sources and the people of that community. So this is a disaster, and it has undermined. I think it is a big source of what I consider the undermining of the liberal ideals of national journalism, and also helps explain how our politics have been nationalized the way they have been, anyway, it's a profound, and there's lots of interesting experiments. And Osita, your hometown of Baltimore, the Baltimore Banner is one of the most exciting experiments in nonprofit journalism, but none of the new models have proved themselves out yet. So please subscribe to your local paper.
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm James. I'm a second-year undergraduate, and the focus seemed to have been on maybe not censorship, but illiberalism from the New York Times. So I'm wondering, are there any examples of more progressive illiberalism that takes the form of like the right-wing stuff, where we see people making claims about going into government and actually removing people? And as far as like on the level of like journalism, you're saying that we get caught in these echo chambers, but at least anecdotally, I'll see something from the other side and then just be like, I disagree with this. So is it only needing to provide further perspectives that will like get us out of these chambers?
So the first question is, is there anything akin to right-wing liberalism with book banning and purges that happen on the right, on the illiberal left?
Do you want to take that one? I just talked a lot. Or one of you guys.
Well, I mean, my answer is no. It's very simple. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in what either of you think, but...
I could break the moderator wall here.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so I do think that there are, I mean, I think the examples that you're describing about the illiberal right are things that you don't see happening in the Biden administration or local governments or any of that. But I do think that there are examples of intolerance on the illiberal left. I could give you some examples as it relates to, I mean, there are examples of illiberalism among liberals, I think. But here's an example that I would point to just in the context of some of the debates over Israel, Gaza, that in the quest to kind of isolate Israel and to turn Israel into a pariah, sometimes that bleeds into the isolation and the deeming of pariah of various Jewish organizations on campus. So Hillel gets depicted as an arm of the Israeli war machine and gets boycotted when Hillel is a source of ritual identification, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that you see that happen a lot of times in the building of coalitions where somebody who disagrees with somebody is cut out on the basis of not adhering to kind of a total party line sense of identification.
If I may, yeah, I don't think we could have this conversation without talking about Gaza and the speech climate on campus when it comes to Gaza. Look, I think it is absolutely true that you see certain examples. I don't think they're representative, but you do see examples of what I would call anti-Semitism being leveraged or pushed against Jewish students on campus, Jewish institutions, and so on. That's reprehensible. It ought to be condemned. I think people do condemn it. I think the broader overall picture of what we're seeing right now happen on American college campuses is a really extraordinary clampdown on the speech of people who are pro-Palestine activists in many, many ways. We just have this case now, this valedictorian who's not being allowed to speak.
Yeah.
We have the Jody Dean case. Now, to reconcile this, and I think this is, what I said at the very beginning about freedom of association holds absolutely true. If you want to have a pro-Israel university where you expect everybody on the faculty and all of your students to respect Israel and to support American foreign policy with regards to Israel, you have the absolute right to do so. If you want to have a university that is more pro-Palestine in certain respects, you have the right to do so. I don't think the standard that people on the left are articulating to defend Jody Dean, and I don't know if we have to give context about who she is and what she did, I don't think that holds water. I think that private institutions have the right to, again, shape their own values. And I accept that there are institutions that are going to do things that I don't like and make decisions that I disagree with on a substantive basis. The argument to be made isn't that, well, if you do this, you're illiberal. If you do this, you are fundamentally at war with liberal principles. It's, I think that what she said was either right or not wrong enough to justify this thing happening to her in this particular case. You don't make this appeal, again, to the superior value that takes the debate into a different register where it doesn't actually
so I don't know if this is a...
We could go on and on and on about this, but...
I think that to make the argument that the other side is worse is a way to always win this particular argument. The other side is worse. I don't think it obviates the reality that it is an illiberal act to commit an act of anti-Semitism on campus. And I think people of the left have a particular responsibility to criticize the left when it makes those kinds of mistakes.
And I think people do. And I think the illiberalism there comes from the
well,
not
except
respecting...
Osita, I just heard you shift the subject immediately to that the other side is worse. And I'd love to hear you pause a little bit more.
I started at the very beginning.
Yeah, but
I paused at the very beginning to say that we have examples of anti-Semitism that are wrong, they're reprehensible. People putting up swastikas on synagogues and Hillel centers. People using anti-Semitic language and anti-Semitic memes to castigate Israel. And I think that's wrong. I think that people have said it's wrong. I think that Jewish leaders in the pro-Palestine movement have said it's wrong.
Do you think
I will
it's
say
illiberal?
it's wrong all day. Huh?
Do you think
I think
it's
it's illiberal because it does not proceed
Okay,
from
well, a
fundamental
moment ago you
respect.
said there wasn't a liberalism on the left. So
I did not say that. In fact, I said at the very beginning, you have examples of people on the left, yes, who reject liberal principles. And I said also that I don't think that they are representative. That was the very first thing I said in this conversation. And I don't think I don't think we can ignore. So a couple of months ago, you had this campaign at multiple campuses around the United States. Harvard, Columbia, UPenn, Yale, Berkeley, GW, University of Colorado Boulder. These are just the ones that I found on the kind of cursory search, where you had trucks going around these campuses that were funded by some group, saying the names of students who belonged to pro-Palestine organizations or Palestine advocacy groups, and saying that these were the campus's leading anti-Semites by name. These people whose only offense had been membership in an organization that they felt that they were too insufficiently supportive of Israel or too pro-Palestine.
Yeah.
Do you see people on the left mounting national campaigns that are funded in this way to isolate and target specific students in this manner?
Do you want to? I could, and I want to move on because there's a lot of. But I would say that is illiberalism that those people are practicing, and I would condemn it. I would condemn cancellations that happen on campuses. I have a different view. I'm breaking moderator's role here, but I have a different view of the way in which institutions should function. So when professors get purged for their political positions, that to me seems like a violation of academic freedom. I think there's a right to regulate how professors treat students in classrooms, and if professors discriminate, that's bad.
Right.
And if
I want to challenge you on this because I think it's an important debate. What do you think the actual limits to that principle ought to be? Are there opinions that you express in your own private life outside of campus that should have some bearing on the way the university treats you as a professional?
I think yes.
Right.
And I also think that protesters shouldn't have heckler's veto, and that it's okay to regulate where protests happen and what form protests happen on a campus.
Right.
That's within. I think
because there's some people who would say
we have a line. I'm just in 6 minutes left.
Sure.
Let's do one more at least.
Hi. So what I see from this conversation is more like a split between two different conceptions of liberalism. One is on liberalism as an adjective, more as live or let live kind of mentality. And another conception of liberalism is a specific set of precepts, basically, individualism plus inalienable human rights. So I wonder, how do you make sense of this split, and whether these two different conceptions can have certain, overlap? And more specifically, if you see liberalism as simply a set of ideology or precepts, how would you confront the issue of hyper-individualism embedded in liberalism? And, and given that tribalism is a fact of life, and the death of community is also part of the problem.
Yeah. Can I take
Let Osita was nodding his head, so.
Well, I think it's a fantastic question. I want to get to this divide, because I think you're right that what we're dealing with here are two fundamentally different conceptions of what liberalism is. On my end, you have a conception that I think is informed by reading the liberal political tradition. And then you have a sense that is kind of more amorphous, that liberalism, it relates to each other. It deals with how we relate to each other in a kind of, in a kind of spirit or a kind of set of habits that we practice in life. I think is kind of wishy-washy, to be honest with you. But I think that is fundamentally the divide. And that speaks to, again, the sense that these questions are hard. I don't think we should sort of just casually say and imply that people who come to different positions are necessarily at war with certain principles. I keep coming back to this because we hear it over and over and over again. This idea that if you were campus progressive and you didn't like this speaker on campus, you are somehow part of the legacy of Joseph Stalin. You are a Maoist. You are somebody who is reviving the Salem witch trials. This kind of escalatory rhetoric about disputes that I don't think has to go there. If we sort of understood that liberalism is complex, and the people who don't necessarily disagree on certain principles, I know that, James, even though you have this other definition of liberalism, you agree with me that individual rights are central to the conception of what liberalism is. I just don't think that we have to get to a place where we say, well, this person, because they disagree with me, is fundamentally opposed to the principles that I agree with. But I wanted to go back to what Frank said just now. about this question of campus.
We'll still go back to you, but this question of the two definitions of liberalism, do you have a response to that?
I don't. If you want to characterize it as wishy-washy, I can certainly live with that. I do think I guess I don't have a complete read on what the difference is. I think, Osita, you are taking maybe a more a legalistic definition, which I also embrace, that is grounded in individual rights. To the extent I'm being wishy-washy or sentimental, I guess I'm talking about an ethos or a spirit of engagement and debate, and I don't think that those are and intellectual contest that I don't think actually is wishy-washy in practice. I think it's pretty ferocious if it's done properly. And it's not about civility, it's not about being nice to each other, it's not about sitting down and saying kumbaya. It's like engaging really big ideas in a fierce contest that allows us to grope our way towards progress and some apprehension of the truth. That to me is liberalism. And I honestly actually no, I would take it back. I don't accept wishy-washy as a description of that attitude. I don't think that that's fair, or to use your term, a generous characterization.
Well, look, I think that there have been all kinds of people throughout history who've rigorously pursued truth and had philosophical arguments who nevertheless believed at the end of the day that the state should have the right to enforce its will upon and impose its will upon people. The idea of having debate is not, I think, something that is unique to the liberal tradition. You've had all kinds of people from all kinds of perspectives and all kinds of backgrounds argue that philosophical debate is important. That to me is not an exclusive property of the liberal political tradition. And I think we confuse ourselves when we say that that's what it is, because it's not what it is. I don't think that you will find people who here, who teach political philosophy will tell you that arguing is what liberal, it's part of it, it's what you would expect to come out of a liberal society more so than other kinds of societies. But I don't think it is definitional. And again, when you insist that something that is so, I think, tethered to an important set of foundational principles, those principles are some things that your enemies disagree with and that they are rejecting and they're attacking. If that is not actually true, and you're instead disagreeing about the extent to which the values you're describing have applied to in a particular situation, I think it's a mistake to do that. If really the case that what we're arguing about is whether or not people have been open enough to certain ideas, and they should as a matter of personal practice and a matter of engaging with journalism and so on, no, those are habits that I think are important to cultivate. When people say, as Jonathan Chait did, the only reason why progressives haven't done the kind of grand illiberal acts that we saw happen under communist regimes is that they don't yet have the powers of the state, and that implying that if they did, I would start sending white people to the gulag or something. That to me is not really like a serious and I think factually informed understanding of what the arguments that people are actually advancing in the interest of racial justice, in the interest of justice for transgender people, in the interest of justice for Palestinians. And if we actually listened to these groups, I think we'd find that we're not actually at war with about liberal values, that we're having certain disputes within institutions that we'd expect to have in a free, democratic society. We have intense arguments about the values that our institutions should hold.
We keep going.
We'll do one more, and then wrap it up.
Hi, I'm Neha. I'm a second-year undergraduate. I would like to ask if you think that mainstream publications like the New York Times are publishing a full range of opinions on the Gaza conflict. And then along with that, do you think they should publish that full range and let the discussion happen in the public? Or do you think that they should be selective about the kinds of opinions published?
I'm not qualified to answer that because I'm no longer a close reader of the New York Times. So I don't know what they're publishing about this.
I would say
What do
that
you
there
think?
should obviously be limits. I would not want things in the New York Times that were published in the interest of arguing for the mass slaughter of Jewish people in Israel. I would not want to have, if I were the editor of the New York Times, something that will never ever happen, pieces that are sort of cavalier about the civilian casualties that we've seen in Gaza. I think that's a reasonable set of boundaries. And I think the critical point there is that any publication has boundaries. It has a circle of opinions that they think are worthy of publication. Even if the editor disagrees with them, they think they're within the bounds of plausibility in certain respects, and things that lie outside that bounds of plausibility. And when we say that actually the people who are imposing boundaries are these people I disagree with because they didn't like this or that op-ed, I think that ignores the reality of what publications functionally do all the time. It ignores the reality that the New York Times or the New Republic or the National Review, whatever, they all have their own particular set of what those circles should look like. And arguing about how wide they are is not an argument necessarily about whether or not you agree with liberal principles. And when you do that, again, as I've said many, many times, as I think that progressives have experienced, this is a way of shutting down debate and marginalizing and pathologizing opinions that I think we should be taking seriously, constituencies that we should be taking seriously that haven't had much of a voice in journalism before.
If I could just distill quickly, and then we'll disappear. What I think is the ultimate disagreement here is that it came out in the question about liberalism, is that I think Osita's emphasis in liberalism is emancipation and freedom. And I think James comes from a different tradition of liberalism that emphasizes that emancipation and freedom are only possible if you have a series of institutional arrangements that help deal with the fact that people have very different ideas about emancipation and freedom, which are frequently in conflict, and that it requires an ethos and a certain set of rules and norms in order to mediate those two things. And I think it's maybe there's that difference of emphasis is at kind of the crux and core of the debate. But I am going to leave it right there because I've already gone over time. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for having this